Welcome everyone to this webinar where we're going to hear about the results of the Canadian Social Connection Survey. My name is John Brewer. I'm a conference designer. I'm a conference poet at times, do some Lego serious play, and I've been engaged in the field of sort of workplace mental health through the events that I do for a number of years. And it's through those and some other activities that I got to know Pete of the GenWell Project, and who are one of the organisers of this event, but also the survey. So before we begin, I would like to just start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm based here in the city of Hamilton, which is the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I further acknowledge this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So the GenWell Project is a grassroots global human connection movement, which was founded in 2016. And obviously social isolation and loneliness is something that has really come to the forefront very much since the pandemic started. And you know, we all learnt the new phrase social distancing was one of the first results of that. But the GenWell Project were advocating for greater human connection before it became a thing for so many people around the world. It's a not-for-profit and charitable partner of the Framework Foundation. Its mission is to create practical, actionable, educational assets and engagement tools that mobilize people to build stronger, more sustainable and social networks and healthier connection habits through proactive, intentional, face-to-face social interaction. So if you want to find out more about the GenWell Project, the website is genwellproject.org. We'll be hearing from Pete Bombaci towards the end of today's session, when we have a sort of a free-for-all and a Q&A. So before we start, I'd like to hand the mic over to Shelley Boutman, who is the president and founding partner of Energy for Growth and the Idea Suite, and has been a supporter and been active participant with the GenWell Project, I would think from probably the very beginning. And she's going to say a few words, and then I'll introduce you to Kiffer Card, who is the researcher responsible for the research report. So, Shelley.
Thank you so much, John and Kiffer and Pete, for giving us this opportunity. So my business partner, Fiona Stevenson, and I founded Energy for Growth this year, really focused on, it's a behavior change program focused on energizing and creating high-performing teams. And we are absolutely thrilled to have sponsored the Human Connection Survey through the GenWell Project and with Dr. Card, because we really feel and believe that human connection is at the heart of happiness and health, but also of team performance and performance in life. And, you know, we did sponsor this research because we have such a firm belief that that's true. And the research shows that human connection is also at the core of burnout. And with the pandemic happening, we know that it's more important than ever for us to get connected in our lives and also to get connected at work. And so we were absolutely thrilled to be a part of this research and thrilled to have been asked to introduce Dr. Kiffer Card today. So thank you, John, for that. And we will leave it there.
Okay, thank you. And so we're going to move on now to the results of the Canadian Social Connection Survey. There were nearly 2,500 Canadians completed the survey, which was developed in partnership with the University of Victoria and led by Dr. Kiffer Card. He's going to be walking through the results and insights during this webinar, and we're certainly hoping to leverage this information to improve social health of Canadians and really kickstart a meaningful and substantial conversation about the impact of loneliness and social isolation and the kind of steps that we as Canadians can make to really improve people's lives through greater social connection. So Dr. Kiffer Card is the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. scholar and assistant professor at Simon Fraser University's Faculty of Health Sciences and the director of research for the GenWell Project. Truly a rising star in social and behavioural epidemiology, and we're delighted to have had him work on this project and also join us today to share the results. So if you have any questions about the research or about the GenWell Project, please just enter them in the chat area. I will be monitoring those, and we're going to have Pete's going to speak a little bit at the end, and then we're going to get to those questions and any others you might want to ask. So Kiffer, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here and to share with you all the findings from the Canadian Social Connection Survey. Could I just get a thumbs up from somebody that my slides are showing? Okay, great. So as I've already been introduced, so that's great. I'm joining from the territory of the Songhees Eskimo, beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. So joining you from here with great appreciation to the Indigenous land hosts here. The kind of table of contents or the outline for this presentation are to give you a bit of a background on the Canadian Social Connection Survey, talk about the prevalence and impact of loneliness, review some of the impacts of pandemic measures, talk about how that fits into our lives as citizens and community members, and then briefly touch on what we think we can do about this, and then introduce you to resources that you can learn more from the Canadian Social Connection Survey. And so to the first point, the Canadian Social Connection Survey is a serial cross-sectional survey with a longitudinal subcohort of participants. That means we have a survey. The goal is to do it annually with a wave each year. And then within that, have a group of people that we follow over time to assess within-person changes. The advertisements and the survey itself are both in French and English, and we recruit nationwide with eligibility criteria restricted to those who live in Canada and are 16 years or older. And recruitment for this first wave, which we're talking about, I guess third wave and first wave is maybe a bit confusing, but it was during the third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, a period in time in which patterns of social connection were, as we all know, very different than they have been in our normal life. So all findings should be interpreted and thought of in context of that global pandemic. Then we use iterative proportional fitting, which is just a fancy term for weighting the sample to help it be more representative of the Canadian population. And so recruitment, as I mentioned, during the third wave was April through July. So the first kind of research question we were interested in, what is the prevalence and impact of loneliness? And I think one of the things that we have known historically about measuring loneliness is it's really tricky and difficult to really ascertain what level of loneliness people are experiencing. This is because loneliness is a stigmatized health behavior, and my research mostly focuses on stigmatized issues. And so saying you're lonely or saying you don't have friends is hard to admit because there is a strong bias towards pro-social individuals. And so what we see is that when we use a measure such as the UCLA 3-item loneliness scale, which is one of the most widely used measures and widely validated measures of loneliness, we see that about half of Canadians were classified as loneliness. This meant that they have scores beyond the cutoff that is standard for use in defining loneliness. And so that's a huge number. When we ask the question directly, we see about 5.6% of people felt lonely all of the time. And so that's about 5 to 7 days a week. This sample, as I mentioned, was among 2,448 Canadians. The full sample size of the Canadian Social Connection Survey is closer to about 4,000, but we restrict down if they're missing any of the measures that we use in our statistical weighting procedure so that our sample can be more representative. We actually know that much smaller sample sizes are required to achieve these sort of estimates. You know, we're not trying to gauge political elections, so 0.1 difference doesn't matter. So generally in presenting our results, we focus mostly on the general trends, not the specific numbers. And so when we look at specific indicators of loneliness and thinking what it means to be lonely, we found that 69% of Canadians felt isolated often or some of the time. 37% wanted to have more friends, 8.6% didn't know any of their neighbors, and 4.4% didn't have even one close friend. And so as you can see, complete social isolation, which is theoretically distinct from loneliness. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone, or you can be completely lonely or completely isolated and not be lonely at all because you're enjoying the solace of being alone. So we can see that there's kind of this disconnect in terms of isolation. Very few Canadians are isolated, but lots of them feel lonely and want to be more connected. We looked at a latent measure. This was created using a statistical technique called latent class analysis, and I don't want you to get lost in the numbers here. There's just one general trend I just want to call our attention to. We created these latent classes by asking people how much time they spent with friends and neighbors and coworkers and family, friends, coworkers, and neighbors. And we found that only about 12% of the population is highly connected to all of those groups. And so those are these kind of socialized people who are bumbling around, greeting people in line, saying hello to their neighbors, getting to know folks in their community. I think of what we consider as an ideal level of social connection, especially if you're an extroverted, excited person to get out there and connect. On the other end of the spectrum, we have isolates, where isolates, very few of them had any contact with coworkers or neighbors, and most were even isolated from family and friends, reflecting the long-term trends in Canada of people to be increasingly likely to live alone and isolated. Then in the between, where you see the bulk of people, you see about half of people were seekers. They were connecting a little bit with all different groups, but not connecting for 4 or 5 hours a week with any one group. And then you had insulars who were really only connecting with family and friends, and very few of them spent meaningful time with coworkers and neighbors. And so hopefully that qualitative picture adds some meaning to some of these other measures like the UCLA direct measurement scale. I think the overall message is that very few people are achieving optimal patterns of social connection for health. Many people are there just looking for ways to connect. So what? So what does loneliness matter? This is probably preaching to the choir in many ways, but I think it's important to be able to put numbers with what we already know about the importance of human connection. We see that among the least happy Canadians, 85% are lonely. Among Canadians who are least satisfied with their lives, 82% are lonely. We see that people who rate their health as poor, 77% are lonely. People who rate their mental health as poor, 95% are lonely. And among Canadians who are most burnout, 92% are lonely. We see that across almost any measure or indicator of health, well-being, isolation, that those people who are lonely tend to have lower quality of life, satisfaction, mental health, physical health, burnout, and so on. And I think that's a really important lesson, that if we're going to address the upstream social determinants of health, we have to account for loneliness, social connection, because it's fundamental to who we are. On the next section, we talk about the pandemic measures and we look at those. And so I think a lot of the context of this is that during the pandemic, lots of people were intentionally isolating themselves, even during the third wave of the pandemic when that started to wane. And so we see that about half of people, a little more so, were practicing physical distancing. 73% were wearing masks, 62% were reducing interactions, and 59% were avoiding indoor socials, so they weren't connecting with folks inside. So of those public health guidance, we see generally a high level of adherence to them. And so that, of course, should color our interpretation of the prevalence and stats, and why ongoing monitoring of social connection is so important for us to understand what happens after the pandemic in terms of our returning to our social lives. When we ask people directly about the impact of the pandemic, as you can imagine, most people reported they are feeling lonelier. 22% reported that they are much more lonely. 40% reported that they were somewhat more lonely. 26% reported that they experienced about the same level of loneliness. And so this reflects the reality that approximately 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 Canadians were lonely before the pandemic even began, and that loneliness persists currently. And then 12% reported being much or somewhat less lonely. And so they found ways to connect. Maybe that's, the ability for more people to connect digitally. Who knows what's going on there? But certainly these people will be interesting to learn from, to see what they did to connect and to reduce their loneliness in a time in which social connection became so important. In the context of the pandemic and the post-pandemic period, there's lots of reasons to be worried or anxious about the potential for greater social disconnection amongst Canadians. We see that telecommuting and distance learning have become popular, and especially amongst workforces where these are possible, they seem likely to stick around, at least in some settings. But however, when we looked at the impact of happiness on people who were learning entirely online, or that they were working exclusively from home, we see that there's an increased odds of being lonely. And so that's about 50% for students who are distance learning, and about 59% of workers who are working exclusively from home. And so that's really concerning, and we need to think through how our social connections work in a post-pandemic world, particularly given the importance of school workplaces in making and building friendships. So what does this mean for community? So outside of workplaces and schools, we asked a number of questions about satisfaction with neighborhood, satisfaction with cohesion, and we see that about 4 in 10 and 7 in 10 feel that they would leave their neighbors, that they would leave their neighborhoods, and that they don't have neighbors over frequently. We also see that in terms of satisfaction, people are generally quite satisfied with their living arrangements. All the way in the bottom right-hand corner, 90% are satisfied with their living arrangements, but much less so are they satisfied with their community programs, public open spaces, and private open spaces. So people are generally satisfied with their built environment in terms of their housing and that sort of thing, but they are dissatisfied with the community infrastructure that is available to them to build social connections. And I think this is reflected by the long-term trend over the past 40 years for the number of Canadians living alone to have more than doubled, and for many forms of social connection decreasing. Membership in clubs and organizations has greatly declined. We know that from Putnam's work on North American social connection and social capital. And when we asked participants about whether they thought others were aware of how lonely they were, the loneliness they were experiencing, we found that 2/3 of respondents felt that others were definitely or probably not aware of how lonely they felt. And so I think this is really important, that loneliness is also an existential feeling of being isolated and separated from others, that others don't understand you or connect with you, and that you really feel alone in your ability to get sort of help. Fortunately, we also see that people tend to have moderate and high levels of social support in Canada, but there are some groups of people, again, this small group of isolated individuals who do experience and report not having anyone to turn on, to count on for support for their basic needs, functional support, and social support. And then 74% of population spent less than 1 hour with their neighbors, 60% less than 1 hour with coworkers, and 47% less than 1 hour with friends, and 38% less than 1 hour with family. So it shows that, especially during the context of the pandemic, that there is a strong tendency for people not to be connecting for meaningful periods of time in the course of a week. And so so I think this is something that we need to think through lots of reasons of why people face barriers to connecting with others, whether that is they're living alone, whether it is the lack of community resources, or it's the strains on their time, taking care of kids, taking care of family, household responsibilities, working, all those sorts of things. And so I think that raises the question of what can we do to address social isolation and loneliness? And I think there are a variety of interventions that have been proposed, but some of the stats from our survey that we felt were really meaningful and important was that 81% would be willing to work with others to improve their neighborhood. 67% would support government funding for programs to educate Canadians on the importance of human connection. People who felt supported by coworkers had 98% lower odds of feeling lonely. Less than half of those who were asked about their relationships, were asked about their relationships during meetings with their doctor. And so that connects to social prescribing interventions. And 43% want to spend more time with friends. We saw 37% earlier wanted to have more friends. And 43% also want to spend more time with their friends. And so there's lots of different interventions in workplaces and schools, education campaigns like those being led by GenWell and other organizations across Canada. And then social prescribing or medicalized interventions that are used to screen for, identify experiences of loneliness, and address them through connecting people to neighborhood associations, events, and community centers. All of those investments are potentially good interventions that need further exploration in this post-pandemic period. And we need to be advocating for government funding to make research and to make interventions that use those methods available and accessible to the public. So if you want to learn more about the Canadian Social Connection Survey, you can visit genwell.com, where we've published a bunch of reports. You can also go to the socialbubbleproject.ca/CSCS. At this website, you can actually access the data dictionary, the terms of use, conduct analyses. We also have created an online portal that allows you to actually look through and filter the data and look at the different samples using our unweighted data. So you can get a sense of some basic sense of what our survey results were. And so, that I invite you to explore that. We want this data to be widely used, and therefore knowing how important this data can be in moving social connection in Canada, we have made it publicly available and accessible to anyone who wants to use it. And so with that, thank you for the opportunity to share, and look forward to now continuing with our conversation with Pete and others about these results, any questions you have, and also just about the issue more generally. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Kiffer. Really appreciate that. Some real, really great food for thought, I think, in those results. And I know that this is just a small window on the many things that you found out. So we're going to have an opportunity to ask Kiffer some questions towards the end, and to have a bit more of an open discussion. And I've certainly got a pretty long list here, but would again encourage you in the chat to enter some questions. But you'll be able to ask them just like you would normally when we get to that point. But I'm going to hand over now to Pete Bombaci. He's the founder and the sort of driving force behind the GenWell Project, and someone who certainly anyone who's met him knows has just such a passion for this issue, and is really doing great work to really improve the lives of Canadians through this idea of human connection. So Pete, if you want to say a few words, and then we'll move to a discussion. Thank you. And you're muted, Peter.
I thought that was the big phrase of 2020, not 2021. Nobody gets muted in 2021. Anyway.
Well, apparently some people, didn't, still haven't got the hang of things. But
can we research that, Vanessa? Can we figure out what the #1 phrase in 2021 is? I think it is going to still be "you're on mute." Thank you, John, and also Kiffer. Thank you for what you do. You have brought such a level of detail, and the research that we've done in this Canadian Social Connection Survey has been so valuable in raising people's consciousness and awareness about social connection, because we now have the facts, the Canadian facts, that are actually helping people recognize just how big of an issue this is. I think I want to say a few things. Obviously, as John pointed out at the start of the webinar, we've been around since 2016, and I will be very honest in saying that when I was talking to people 5 years ago about the importance of human connection, most people thought I was crazy, literally crazy. And I often thought it as well, going through that journey. But here we are 5 years later. We're celebrating our 5th anniversary this week. And it really has come so far, certainly with the help of Kiffer, but there's nothing like a global pandemic locking people down for 18 months to wake people up to just how much we actually need each other. And, from day one, we've been about 3 things. We've been about educating people, because the reality is we've all been told to exercise 30 minutes a day. We've had participation since 1971, so they're celebrating their 50th year. And prevention is not easy. So there's a reason why we still are around. They're still around 50 years later, because prevention is something that needs to be reminded, needs to be encouraged, and needs to be, executed on an ongoing basis to get the best results. We've had the Canadian Food Guide since 1942 that tells us that we should eat healthier foods. And whether you choose to do so or not, like the exercise, is really up to you. But the reality that still is around today, because prevention isn't easy. And, we get caught up in our busy, fast-paced lives, and it's really important for us to continue to remind people about the importance of those healthy habits that we can all take. And the reality is social connection now, by research, is said to be a greater indicator of our health than smoking, obesity, and high blood pressure. So they're now suggesting it's more important for us to stay socially connected than it is to exercise and eat well. Now, those are still obviously very important, but if we have that third pillar of the chair and we're not educating people, and we are literally starting from ground zero. You know, this has not been taught in schools. It's been not taught in workplaces. It's not educated in the far reaches of our country. And it's right now that at the other side of this pandemic that we need people to understand the importance of human connection to their health, their happiness, their longevity, and frankly, to the overall success of society. Because it builds empathy and compassion for one another and so much more. So that's the education component that we've been working on since 2016, putting out that information on a daily basis through our social channels and through our website, which we recently relaunched, and continuing to upload new content as we go here. Number two, we empower people. At the end of the day, we have to stop creating a system that waits till people are sick before we try to help them. You know, we have a system that is built on identifying people once they have a crisis or an issue. What we're trying to do is have a preventative focus and a preventative lens on the issue of human connection. It is important for us to educate the people that aren't sick yet about the importance of social connection to keep them healthy. And that's really a big focus. And every Friday, as well as the posts that we do each and every day to inspire and motivate people to start building healthy connection habits starting today, every Friday, we post an infographic that gives people some tips, tools, and ideas on how they can get started. And last Friday was something very powerful. It was how students can get started building connections. And I've had outreach from several teachers who thanked us for the work we're doing because kids are struggling right now to make the connection. And I will, as I finish up that empowerment one, tell you that when I started, everybody thought that this was a seniors campaign, and that this was really great, that I was going to try and get seniors connected again. And I said, well, that's interesting. Is it just seniors that you think are dealing with loneliness and isolation? Because the problem with seniors is it's not telling seniors to get connected. It's everybody else being reminded that we need to make time to see our seniors. And now that message is for all of us to recognize that we can all play a part in everybody's life. And it's not just COVID-19, it's divorce, it's job loss, financial pressure, kid problems, homeschooling, 28% of the population living alone, as Kiffer pointed out. All those things lead to the more disconnected world that we find ourselves waking up in today. And as Shelley pointed out in her introductory comments, right now, we have an issue in our workplaces where we are not connected, both physically because we can't be in the office, but more importantly, emotionally connected to each other. And we know that a person who has a best friend at the office is 7 times more productive. And there's a long list of benefits that come from greater human connection in the workplace. And it's not a surprise that most leaders don't know about it, because most of the information is only 20 years ago. So when they went to MBA school or they went to wherever they went to get their education, they probably didn't learn about this. And so we are all, and I say this to everybody who's on this screen, we are all part of the team that's educating our leaders, politicians, business leaders, community leaders, to get them up to speed so that we can entrench this information in what we do each and every day to make the world a happier and healthier place. And the final thing we do, other than educate, empower, is we catalyze. And this upcoming weekend, and I encourage everybody to head over to GenWellProject.org today, we catalyze people around 2 weekends a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. And those were all built based on the knowledge and the insight that people struggle most with seasonal transition. Many people think that suicide rates are highest at Christmas time or in the colder, darker days of winter. It's actually the springtime. And one of the reasons for that number is because of seasonal transition. There certainly is some issues that come because of the pollination coming out of trees and the allergies that come that inflame the body. But one of the other things that researchers have pointed to is the social pressures that come with warming temperatures. So as we come out of the dark, colder days, and just think of this, in a normal winter, fall and winter, we're in the dark, colder days for 4 months. We're coming out of 18 months of cold, dark days. And yes, we've had some bright lights through the global pandemic, but we have a society that's been more disconnected from one another for a very, very long time. And we need to help build these connections. We need to encourage people. We need to give them excuses to get connected. And that's what GenWell Weekend is. And seasonal transition in the fall, although it comes with different struggles and challenges, that faster pace coming off the slow pace of summer, we want to get people reconnected right now before we head back into those darker, colder days. And we want to connect people when everybody's on your street, not half of them away on vacation or half of them doing something else in their lives, because summer times create that. We want to give people the excuse and the opportunity to get connected at schools on Friday, businesses on Friday, and then take that message home into your street, into your home, onto your community on the weekend. So if everybody would be kind enough to head over and let us know who you're going to get connected with this weekend, that would be great, because every one of us has the opportunity to make a huge impact on just one more person every day. And if we all make that effort each and every day, we can make the world a happier and healthier place. So that was a bit of a pitch, but also a bit of, hey, there's a reason why we're doing this. This isn't just fun and games, as many people thought early on. And because of the research that Kiffer's brought forward, and I'm actually going to stop and just say, hey, I know everybody on here actually gets this. They believe in this. That's why you're here. So you're not the people. I'm preaching to the converted. This is about, how do we get this message out further? How do we find the business partners who recognize the value of being part of this solution and bringing Canadians together? How do we find the school leaders? How do we find the community leaders who understand this, not through the lens of a crisis? Let's not do it, hey, you've got a mental health crisis, now you should get connected. It's like, no. This is a prevention message. You know, we have lots of food insecurity out there, and they do a great job at building community. We have to stop waiting until the person has no food left before we actually try to get them connected. And I see Amy McFarlane on here, and she works with a lot of disabled people. And for me, the opportunity is not just in educating the people that are marginalized or struggling or feeling lonely and isolated. It's everybody else that plays a role in recognizing that each of us, by reaching out to somebody each and every day, can make a difference. And if you think of the people who've battled with disabilities, I have a deaf sister, so I certainly have one perspective, but we all can play a role in making not only our lives better, but helping other people as well. And it may be the greatest gift we can give each other right now is the gift of human connection. So with that, I'll stop talking and pass it back to John. But thank you, everybody, for being here today. It really means a lot.
Thank you, Pete. And as you see, he's passionate on the subject, so I demonstrate that. And one thing you mentioned there, just towards the end, about employers and getting them to understand this. And I saw a stat yesterday, which was about a lot of the talk in business right now is about the Great Resignation. You know, this idea that people are leaving en masse for jobs, leaving jobs to go to other ones. And this particular stat, and I didn't see quite where it was from, but I'd seen similar things elsewhere, said that, you know, something like 60% of people are leaving jobs because they don't feel they belong, which is saying really they don't have a social, meaningful human social connection with the people they work with and with the organization. So I think it is something that should be a priority for business, just from that one simple perspective. So we've got plenty of time for questions, so please do sort of, you know, raise your hand or wave or whenever you have a question. There's a few on in the chat, which I'll get to. The first one I wanted to mention, and it's great to see Cassidy Killam on this call. I've not had any direct contact with Cassidy for a number of years, but she's genuinely I think, you know, absolutely, I don't think anyone would argue she's been a pioneer in this field. And she commented, Kiffer, about how much she liked the fact that you said that love is spelled T-I-M-E. And I certainly, I agree, I like that kind of connection. But one of the things I saw, and I'd appreciate maybe Cassidy and you weighing in on this, is, you know, you measured sort of crude time that people spend with other people, whether it be neighbours, family, co-workers. And I remember when I had young children, all the talk was about quality time. You spend quality time with your kids. Is there a qualitative element to that we're missing? I mean, is that measurement just of time? Is that a good analog for the quality of connection, or is it the quality of connection a kind of a diversion, as it were? Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I think the stunning thing that kind of stuck out to me in our numbers of some stats we pulled around this is we did ask people about the amount of time they spent with others and the amount of time that they spent with others that they felt was meaningful. And is what we generally see is that a high rate of it's very common for people to report meaningful time with others, and that even 72% of time spent with neighbors was reported as being meaningful time. And to me, that's, I personally don't know my neighbors that well, so it was personally quite surprising to me that people would find time talking with their neighbors meaningful. But I think the reality of it is that when you connect with others in a social setting, when it's not for work or when it's not like oriented towards those tasks, that you're very likely to find it to be a meaningful, rewarding, and enriching experience. And so that is important. I think we also looked into this issue of like, do we look at quantity versus quality? And you actually see that quantity really has the strongest tenets of predictors. Now, there's lots of reasons that could be, because people who tend to be more socially connected maybe tend to have a more positive outlook about their connections and that sort of thing. So it's a difficult question to figure out. But I think if we can get people to find those connections, then a lot of it is just the biological response. We know that connecting with others socially has, anti-stress impacts. It has a lot of benefits because we are social creatures. We're made. We've evolved to, when we're around people, that brings about a sense of safety and security. When you're alone in the wilderness, as an early human, that was a very frightening and stressful experience. And so you've been driven to connect with others. And so I think that's why we see these high rates of like positive outcomes for folks when they do spend time with each other. So get the time first, and then, if that's not quite doing it, then start searching out quality would probably be how I'd go about it.
I think there's also another thing, if I could just build on that, Kiffer, is one of the things that our aspiration of the GenWell Project is to educate people about the value of all relationships, because certainly one of the things Robin Dunbar and Dunbar's numbers certainly talks about the quantity and how many we can manage, but there's also a balance to it. One of the things I found really shocking out of our research is spending time with neighbors didn't make you happier. And some of us have probably experienced that. But actually it increased your chances of being less lonely by 3 times. So and we know that relationships with colleagues, I think, had the greatest increase in happiness. And so each one of these relationships is really important to really combining to give people the support that they need. And interestingly enough, if you think of somebody who loses a job, and I've experienced it myself, when you're fully engaged in work and you leave or lose a job, or maybe you have a fight with a relationship or a family member, or maybe you're a neighbor and you have a battle over, a friend of mine just ended a relationship with his neighbor because his dog barked too much. So if you think about all these things that can happen in our lives, the important thing is to recognize if all of your relationships are in one quadrant of that and you lose those relationships, what are you doing? And this is where we want to educate. And we are working on a guide for Canadians to better understand the importance of human connection and how they work together to build a happier and healthier you. And I think the other point that I thought was really interesting in the survey was that 65% of our relationships, the connections we made every day, were unscheduled. And so what the pandemic did was wiped out the relationships, those casual collisions that we had at Starbucks or Boxcar, or the places we used to go on our street, the people used to see. We weren't running out of the house every day and seeing people in the drive, the Starbucks, the lunchroom, the coffee machine. And those casual collisions, although quality is important, those casual collisions also give us a sense of belonging, that we are not alone in this world. And I think that's a really important thing for us to recognize, that it is quality, but it is also all those other relationships, the 65% of people that you run into every day that you didn't mean to see, but when you saw them, you went, "Hey, Kiffer, how are you, man? I haven't seen you in so long. How are you doing?" And those people have such a great impact. They can boost our soul, in seconds. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that.
Yeah, before we move on from this, I think maybe just adding that unmeaningful time that you don't find meaningful, does serve a functional purpose in that, when you're starting a relationship, it may not be that meaningful to you, but that's how we build relationships, as you spend time with folks. I think there's been some research recently published during the pandemic that showed, I want to say it was like 1,000 hours to take somebody from being a stranger to a friend. And so I think I think that functional element of this unmeaningful time is how you make sure that you keep a churn going. People move away, you lose friends, people leave their jobs, they leave their workplaces. It's important to be able to cycle friendship into your life.
I happen to have a neighbour with a very noisy beagle, and I was tempted to go over and see them before this started and said, "Can you take that dog for a long walk? Because I've got an hour to be on a webinar." But I think what you said, and as you're saying that, but both of you, I'm thinking about, Pete, you mentioned the food guide since 1942, and I think the food guide is a good analogy, because the food guide doesn't say, go out and eat nothing but vegetables, right? In the same way that social connection is not about, I'm going to sort of binge on having I need more and more close friends. It is those casual encounters, as well as the sort of, the friendship, the family, the neighborhood, etc., sort of nested, that are really important. So I think that the food guide is a great analogy for that reason. Vanessa, you had your hand up momentarily there. Did you have a question?
I did. I didn't know if you noticed it. I had a question about the missing the casual encounters, because I mean, obviously that's huge, and we're all so scheduled in our day-to-day lives that having to schedule more. I know anecdotally from my perspective, I have 4 kids. If I have to schedule one more thing, I'm probably going to rip every single bit of my hair out. So we all want to connect, but we're missing those casual encounters. But now we do need to schedule because they're harder to have. Does that actually add more stress on people? And they want connection, but they don't need to schedule anymore. And then Shelley brought up this really interesting point about, we all think we're reaching out to people, but then people are feeling lonely and saying, why haven't you reached out to me? But we're probably not reaching out to the same one. So then there's even more pressure to do that. So then in fact, do we actually start to shut down? So it's I guess it's not really a question, it's more of a statement, but I guess the question is, how can we get those casual encounters that we know are so important without adding more stress to our lives and scheduling?
Yeah, I think we did ask in the survey, we asked about the effort to connect with others and the effort to connect with you that others put into you. And we see that if you do put more effort to connect with others, that you report, greater likelihood of burnout, those sorts of things. There are definitely consequences to struggling to connect, and especially not having success in connecting. And so I think that does think about why a message like GenWell's is so important, because it gives people, evidence-based and strategies on how to connect, how to maximize those efforts. But it is also an important lesson, I think, that we're telling people that 4 in 10 people want to spend more time with you. They want to have more friends. And I think for those of us who have the energy and ability to reach out to others, we certainly, it's something we should invest time in doing, because not everyone has the ability to spend time to put in that extra energy to connect. And I think that is a big problem here, in that it's difficult, right? I think a lot of us are running on fumes at this point, and it can be hard to find that time to connect.
Maybe that's where the neighbor comes in, and those relationships that are closer to you. And not taking those for granted. And even if it is a barking dog, how do you get through that and find some type of positive relationship with the people that are close in vicinity to you to give you that recognition, to give you that connection?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Vanessa. I also think one of the most important things we can encourage people, and we do it on our infographics many weeks, which is create regular occasions. I play hockey 3 times a week. When you don't have to schedule, when you have something in your calendar where you go to every week, and you don't have to, hey, do you want to get together, and who's coming and who's not? It's like, I'll see you there. And especially if it's something that's a large group of people, that it doesn't matter if 3 people show up and you need to connect that week, they're there for you. But if it's 20, even better, so I think we also, and let's hope as we come out of this pandemic, and it's another reason why I believe that the GenWell Project is so important. We need to drive and catalyze people to get back out. And yes, we understand that people are fearful right now. We're in the 4th wave. We know that there's issues with vaccines, but when people feel comfortable, and Kiffer, is always educating me on, the longer we stay disconnected, the longer we are out of the habit, the less likely we are, or the more challenging it will be to start the habit. So our goal this weekend, and again, and I want everybody to go register, because this is about making it intentional. You guys are all aware. You wouldn't be here if you weren't aware and conscious about the importance of human connection. But now we need to make it intentional. I'm going to get connected with who? Because I think if we can be more intentional and in those conversations, and, you know, have these open and honest dialogues of, yeah, you know what, I felt lonely. I think the power of the pandemic is that we've all experienced this. Whereas when you go through a divorce and you're inside your own home, you feel disconnected because nobody else out there is going through, at least nobody you know in the moment is, it feels like they're going through it. Everybody's experienced what it's like to feel disconnected right now. And everyone can share, hey, you know, I've had some tough times, you know, going through this pandemic, and that's okay. And hopefully that will break down some of the barriers that will allow people to be more open, to give them a catalyst like GenWell Weekend to say, hey, Sam Kupti, who I'm seeing tomorrow night, who's on the call today, one of the most inspiring people I know. And it was because of GenWell Weekend. We have a musical performer playing Saturday on our driveway. Why? Because I wouldn't have invited people if I didn't have the excuse. And that's what we're trying to do, is catalyze people to take action, because most people know we innately, we need it, we want it, but we all have that long list of people that we still haven't reached out to. And I do think, just one final thing, we all need to be empathetic and compassionate through this next year or two as we slowly bring people back into human connection, because not everybody's going to be racing back to it.
There's certainly a lot of data indicating a lot of people are very reticent about, you know, because it's not just that we've been isolated from people, it's that people are actually vectors for a threat, right? So but one thing that struck me that I think maybe relates to this back and forth you had was that in the research, Kiffer, you had that question about, do you think that other people recognize your loneliness, right? Do they see you as being lonely? Which sort of speaks, I think, to some of the sort of stigma around it and the reluctance to talk about it. I wonder, did you ask the following question? Because if you didn't, I'd love to know the answer to it, by the way, is whether people see other people as being lonely. So do you think, well, I'm lonely, but, you know, Pete's got loads of friends and he does a bunch of stuff and he's always so outgoing. So he can't, I'm not only am I lonely, but I'm alone in being lonely, in a sense that we don't, which then makes us reluctant to kind of reach out because, well, you know, he's probably got enough friends anyway. Is that something does that resonate at all?
I think we did. I think we did ask that, but I don't think I've looked closely at those results yet. So I'll have to get back to you sometime. Maybe we'll put out a blast.
You have to get back to that. Which also leads me into Amy McFarlane made a comment about, and she works with people with disabilities and mental illness, and so sort of social health has not been has been something which they've known about for years, but other people outside that field maybe not so much. And you know, my experience of working in the area of workplace mental health is that loneliness is something that doesn't get spoken about, and so we need to, you know, we need to change people's attitudes. I think that Canada has done quite a good job with mental health more generally around depression and anxiety, about making that conversation easier, but loneliness still retains that, you know, that real deep stigma. Any thoughts on how we can, you know, work harder to break that down?
Yeah, being a you know, stigma researcher and health equity researcher, I think looking at some of these population trends is really important. And in fact, we see people with disability. You know, if you have a disability, it greatly increases your risk for, you know, poor physical health, mental health, loneliness, all of that, but especially loneliness. And whether that's because you're homebound, whether it's because disability itself is greatly stigmatized. People repulse in the same way that you talked about with COVID, right? People view disease. We have an innate response to disease that makes us want to pull away from people. We have innate responses to disability, disfigurement, all those sort of things to pull away from people. All of that creates isolation for the people who are living with disability, chronic health issues, and infectious diseases. And so it is just great. You know, it's a hugely critical issue. And yeah, I mean, if anywhere where we hope to see advancement is for those, because that people with disabilities are the group with the highest rates of loneliness and isolation. And so, yeah, certainly I, you know, recognize that this has been on their agenda for a long time because of that.
And I'll just build that again in that particular discussion. I will say that the education is probably not to the individuals that are living it. And Amy and I had the opportunity to be on an Autism Canada webinar where we were talking about the value of human connection. And the message wasn't to the people that were living with autism. It's to the other 99% of Canadians who don't have autism, who might be able to take an extra second, who might be able to reach out, who might be able to build that bond and that connection and give that sense of belonging to somebody who might be struggling because of their situation. So I think it's really important for us to recognize there's two points to this. And let's recognize GenWell is not here. If somebody is in crisis, that's why we have hotlines and emergency rooms and doctors and other things. Our goal is to keep the percentage of the population that isn't there yet. And maybe even they're teetering on going there. And if we can recognize in ourselves the power that we have to help people, maybe we can pull that person back. I literally had a guy this week call me. He just told me that he had a mental health breakdown recently. I didn't know about it. And he sent me a note saying he'd love to connect. I called him right away. And his first thing he said to me was, "Thank you so much for picking up the phone." And so when we hear that, I hope that that actually catalyzes all of us to think about somebody and pick up the phone and make that call. But I do want to say something about social health. And I certainly want to call out Kasley Killam, who's here, who's a graduate from the public health course, I think master's at Harvard, who really is the champion of social health. She's been writing about it for nearly 5 years, and it's great to have her on this call. But I think the real insight for all of us is to recognize physical and mental health. Social health is a part of physical and mental health. When we've been telling people as part of participation for 50 years, we can tell you to go for a walk, go for a bike ride. You can do those things alone. Even eating well, I can encourage you to go eat better food. You go to the grocery store, that's your choice. Here's why the GenWell Project and a society or a population level program is so critically important. Social health takes two. And so educating people that not only do I need to reach out, but you, Vanessa, need to be open to my outreach, or you, John, need to be open to my outreach, and recognizing that this is a play. This is a connection that's in motion. And every one of us, when somebody gives you the nod on the street or says hello to you or in the office or wherever, you have an opportunity to take that 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes out of your day to make not only you happier and healthier, but the other person as well. And that's why I think it's so critically important. And I paraphrase what Maslow said: the bottom level of the hierarchy, mental and physical health. Next level up, he called love and belonging. We've stolen it and we're using social health, but Maslow isn't around, so what will he care? But I think it's really important for us to recognize that social health takes two. And that's why it's not just about educating the people that might be struggling, but educating all of us about the importance of human connection in our lives.
Yeah. Amy, you have your hand raised there. We have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I'm sorry, there's a bit of construction happening in my house. The importance about social health, in particular for the disability community, but it applies to many and most, is actually the interdependence that they rely on for quality of life and independent life. And when the pandemic happened, much of that was taken away with respect to services halting, things being inaccessible. And so that's a real big problem. And so, you know, it affects all of us, this interdependence, and also our society really doesn't talk about how we are interdependent. There's such a fight for being independent, don't rely on other people. And there's a great injustice if we continue to perpetuate that thought. So I think interdependence and social health have to go hand in hand, in particular for the disability community. That is the biggest struggle, the biggest barrier to social health. Just some food for thought. I think it's important that it's added to the language.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a question here from Sandy, it's a question with very serious implications, in fact, although all of this does. And he says he's curious about the relationship between radicalization and social isolation. We see this in the election in many other communities. Any thoughts? There's one thing I saw recently, and it was an article by someone who's involved in the de-radicalization of people online. And what he said is that people will shop for a cause. You said you'll be surprised how many people who were members of the Taliban who are now white supremacists or something. These sort of flips from one side to another, because people look for where they have a strong sense of belonging. It's belonging that drives people to join radicalized groups, which would lead me, to say that there is certainly a very deep connection between isolation and radicalization. I don't know, Pete or Kiffer, whether you have a take on this at all.
Yeah, so we did look, and we did see in our survey data at relationships across a variety of demographic factors. As I mentioned, people with disability were a population that really stood out to us, people with mental health illness, Two-Spirit, LGBTQ community members, all faced greater rates of loneliness. And it's what we generally see from these data is that if you have a vertical community, meaning it's inherited or it's kind of natural to your identity, and that your parents share those identity traits, you don't generally see a lot of decline in the social connection. So, you're part of a community. And so we actually didn't see that racialized individuals experience greater loneliness. We do know from the broader literature, which is a dimension we did not look at, that those communities tend to have lower social capital. Social capital is slightly different from social connection, and that social capital is your ability to leverage those social connections to advance your needs and interests and that sort of things. And that speaks to the great levels of discrimination against racialized people and the way those communities operate. It's not that there isn't any social capital within those communities. A lot of, for instance, new migrants, we know from the literature, experience actually a lot of great capital because they're able to network within their tight-knit communities. So people who don't have those kind of vertical connections with their community. If you're gay, your parents aren't gay, you're not surrounded by other gay people. If you're disabled, your parents may not be disabled. You may not be surrounded by other people with disability. And so those tend to be really the potential sources of isolation. But if you've got a community kind of built in, which many racialized people do, we shouldn't naturally expect that people who are racialized experience everything, disadvantage. Certainly they do. But I'd say the mechanisms that disadvantage the social health of minorities tend to be discrimination, stigma, particularly when it comes to employment, education, housing, credit, all those sorts of things. And those have very serious consequences overall, but we don't see an independent effect for racialized people on loneliness per se.
Radical, you said radicalized, right?
Well, I didn't stop you there, Kiffer. I think we had a bit of a miscommunication. The question was about radicalization, not racialization. But I didn't stop you because I had a question about racialized groups and also gender as well. So that's why I let you go on. But just to clarify, Sandy's original question was about radicalization.
I misread it. Sorry about that.
So that's okay. No. But what you said was valuable, and like I said, it was going to be my next question. So Pete, I think, did you want to weigh in on this? Or?
Yeah, and Sandy, I think you want to. Do you want to build on it or a question on the question?
Just a quick little thing, because I really appreciated your results of the research, and I think it's super valuable. There's one thing that I wanted to ask, and it was related to this question about radicalization, because I think I was reminded of this Marshall McLuhan dictum: the medium is the message. And one of the things that this whole GenWell project is all about face-to-face communication, but a lot of people's communication is through various other media. And I was wondering if at some point you want to do a study of the way that people have interactions with other people, and whether it is with interactive media or one-way media.
Now there's a theory called media richness theory, which has been around for probably about a decade or more than that. It's been around probably 2-3 decades. That really came out of technology studies looking at workplaces and this issue. And we see that the more rich a media is, the better. So in-person is the best form of social connection, next video, then audio, then text. And so there really does seem to be a dose response in how much exposure you're getting to somebody and how enjoyable that experience is.
But just one really quickly. Sorry to keep interrupting. It's the video. I know it's valuable, but there's video like this video, which is interactive, and then there's video like TV, which is not interactive. And I wonder if there's a I don't know of any studies about this, and I'm interested in knowing what the difference is, because I feel like a lot of radicalization comes from people with seeking one-way media, where they don't really get to participate.
Yeah, I'm not answering it directly, Sandy, but I think without question, I think when you lose that face, so Siobhan Palvetson, who's now the head of Rogers Corporate Social Responsibility, used to be the head of Civic Action, and her comment to me when I first connected with her was that the GenWell Project is the perfect antidote to political polarization. And if you actually take it from a political standpoint and go to radicalization, if you look what happened on Yonge Street with the van attack, or you look at the gentleman on Danforth, in both cases, they highlight specifically in the studies or in the background of the situation that those individuals were lonely and isolated. Again, when I talk about the many benefits that come from building greater connections in our lives and in our communities, it goes far beyond our health and our happiness. And maybe when we say happiness, it actually goes to a happier community and a safer community, because those individuals who didn't have that person that they connect with, that community they could connect with, found that community, to your point, Sandy, online, and B, whether it was passive or whether it was engaged, and because I think in the van attack, the gentleman was encouraged by whoever it was, who obviously had no care for him as a human being or what he did in his community, because that person didn't live in it. Those type of relationships, whether it's, you end up in the Middle East in a battle, or whether you do something like that, every one of us has an opportunity to connect with people every day walking out of our homes. Yes. That could prevent those types of things from happening.
Okay. We're approaching, or in fact, we're past the top of the hour, so I think probably we should wrap up, being mindful of people's time. Are there any comments, Kiffer or Pete, that you just want to close with? Something that you really want, a message you really want to deliver?
Kiffer.
Thanks all for attending. It's great to be here, and great conversation. If you have questions, feel free to reach out anytime.
Yeah, ditto here. Love the conversation. Thank you for everybody for being a part of it. And again, we are just we are 5 years into this, but we are still ahead of the curve. People are still just waking up to the role that social health plays in their lives. And I champion every one of you. You're now officially, ambassadors. I don't know how I grant you that official ambassador title, but everybody has the opportunity to go out and make a difference. So thank you to those who already have, and to those who want to take the torch and do even more. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you both. Pete, obviously for starting with GenWell Project, your passion, the way you're moving this forward, and Kiffer, some really great research. I look forward to seeing more of it as it comes out. And I know, Pete, you said you're posting regularly to social media with little nuggets of information, so I'd urge you all to sort of check that out. Thank you all for your questions and everything else. I'm going to leave you with one really brief anecdote that I think illustrates just how fundamental the issue of loneliness and social isolation are. And I stole this from my favorite biologist, Steve Jones, who's out of the UK. And what he said was, that we are, if you look at the sort of the animal kingdom, we are most closely related genetically to social primates, which is the chimp. The chimpanzee is our closest relative, which is why the worst punishment you can inflict on a human is solitary confinement. If we were more closely related to the orangutan, which is a solitary ape, the worst punishment you could inflict on someone would be to make them host a cocktail party. So that, I think, illustrates just how fundamental it's a biological thing as much as a social thing. So thank you all. Hopefully we'll meet in person one day, or again on a webinar. And I hope you found your time here useful. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.